Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to our community partners for supporting today's program, the Austrian Honorary Consulate, the Hungarian American Association of Washington, the Honorary Consulate of Austria in Seattle, and Alliance Francaise Seattle. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. We at the Holocaust Center for Humanity acknowledge that our Holocaust Center is on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. 79 years ago today, December 8th, 1941, the world was reeling from the bombing of Pearl Harbor only the day before, on December 7th, 1941. More than 2,400 people were killed and another 1,178 injured when Japanese fighter planes launched a surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii. On this day, December 8th, in 1941, President Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Congress approved, and the US officially entered the conflict of World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor had impacts far beyond the United States. Adolf Hitler supported the attack and declared war on the United States, even though the United States had only declared war against Japan. Before Pearl Harbor, many Americans maintained an isolationist stance and were reluctant to become involved in the war in Europe. Hitler's declaration is seen by many historians as one of his greatest errors in judgment. In less than a year, American ground troops would be fighting German forces in North Africa. Jews living in areas under control of Nazi Germany felt a cautionary hopefulness with the involvement of the United States. However, fear in the US was hitting new heights, and it would be only a couple of months before the United States was rounding up a segment of its own citizenry and imprisoning them in Japanese internment camps. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Aggie Day was about 1.5 years old. Living in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the Nazis had invaded Belgrade only a few months earlier, in April 1941. After the Nazi occupation, Aggie and her family fled Belgrade and walked 196 miles to Budapest, Hungary, which was not yet under Nazi control. In 1944, the Nazis occupied Hungary, and Aggie's mother found a place for her, now 4 years old, to hide. Aggie survived the war in hiding with non-Jewish families and was reunited with her mother at the end of the war in May of 1945. Aggie is a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanities Speakers Bureau and shares her story of survival with students and community groups across the Pacific Northwest. I'm so honored to have with us today, Aggie Day. Aggie will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A option on your screen to type in questions at any time. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, please enter in your questions into the comments. Aggie, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Alana. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. And today, now you'll hear my story. So this was my story of my survival as a hidden child during the Holocaust. My family history on my mother's side begins in Hungary, and for many generations, my family is from Hungary on my mother's side. However, unfortunately, I have absolutely no history from my father's side, except that he was not Hungarian, he was Serbian. And I was born in Yugoslavia, Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And when a Jewish girl is, after she's born, about 8 days later, it's officially named in a synagogue. And that's exactly what happened. I was named in a synagogue in Belgrade And this is the actual synagogue where I was named. Now, sorry. Oh. This synagogue still exists. It's the only synagogue in Belgrade that survived the war. And I actually wrote them, and they sent me information on my birth and here's my birth certificate. This is a picture of Belgrade. As you can see, 1934, way before I was born. However, it's a large city. And in 1941, when I was about 8, 9 months old, Germans invaded Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav infantry surrendered very quickly when the German army invaded. So as Jews, that was a very scary situation. And very shortly after the invasion, my parents had a knock on the door, and about 2 or 3 German officers arrived and informed my parents that they had to leave their home. They were just leaving right then and there. You can imagine the consternation of my parents. I also had a sister who was 13 years old. And my mother, who was a very, very brave woman and a very strong-minded woman, somehow managed to convince these officers that if they let us stay, my father, my mother, my sister, and myself, if they let us stay in the maid's room, she would cook and clean for these officers. Now, can you imagine that? Frankly, for me, every time I think about that and I look around my home, I cannot believe somebody coming into your home saying you have to leave, but then there was nowhere for them to go. So my mother quickly thought of this solution, and they actually accepted. And so the situation went on. I don't know for how long. However, obviously my parents realized this could not continue. And my mother and father tried very hard to get out of Belgrade. My mother, of course, was in touch with her mother in Budapest, Hungary. And in Budapest, things were better. The Germans had not quite arrived there. And my parents made plans to go to Budapest. Well, this was not easy because, of course, the Germans were all over Belgrade. My parents tried all kinds of ways and finally decided that the only way for them to go was to start to walk and escape from Belgrade, which they did. And they started to do that. And here is their part of their journey. I remember my sister telling a story of the abandoned stores that were everywhere. And there were jewelry stores and clothing stores and food stores. And they had stumbled upon a store which was a candy store. My sister had found a small little cart, and she went in there and took all kinds of candy because that was food. That was what was important, nothing else. Food wasn't important and jewelry wasn't important. So they commenced this journey, and most of it was walking. And I remember my mother saying how exhausted they were, and there was very little food. And it was a very scary situation, but they did arrive in Budapest to my grandmother and settled there. Now, in Hungary, in November 1940, Miklos Horthy, and you see him here with Hitler, he joined Germany in the alliance. And in 1941, Hungary declared war on Russia. In 1941, August, Hungary began deporting Jews of non-Hungarian citizenship, like my father, he was Serb. However, the Jewish Hungarian citizens were protected from being deported to concentration camps. And in December 1941, Hungary entered the war alongside Germany. So my father and mother were living together. We were all living together with my grandmother. And one day, I was about 2 years old, I a neighbor of my mother's, of my grandmother's, excuse me, neighbor of my grandmother's decided to inform upon my parents that there was a Jew living there who was not of Hungarian descent, who was not a Hungarian citizen. So my parents were called to the Gestapo, and they went and went to the building where the Gestapo were situated. And when they entered the building, luckily for my parents, my mother ran into somebody that she'd gone to school with, and he was working there. And he was astounded to see her, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And she actually said they had been summoned by the Gestapo, and he told her, "Turn around, run, get away from here, because you'll never get out alive." Well, my parents did, and that's the last I saw of my father, because I remember being 2 years old and standing at the door crying because he went into hiding into the countryside. So during that time, even though Jews were not being deported, it was a very, very difficult time. The young men of Hungary, Hungarian Jewish men, were put into work camps. Many, many of them died of starvation and lack of work. They overworked them. And this is actually a picture I found of my uncle, my mother's brother. And here he is in the work camp. It looks like they're lining up to either for food or going to do some kind of work. So life during that time was pretty difficult, but Hungarians lost their jobs and so on. However, they were able to live until the deportation of Hungarian Jews, which began in 1944. Now, here's a picture of a small town, and you can see the deportation of the Jews starting here. The Arrow Cross Party took over for what was the same as the Gestapos in Germany, and they were even worse than the Gestapos. And they started deporting the Hungarian Jews immediately and pretty well wiped out all of the countryside of all the small villages, because the small villages consisted of Orthodox Jews. And and the Hungarian Jews were the last of the Jews that were being deported, so much so that in fact, some of the camps were already leaving the Jews, letting the Jews from the camps out, while the Hungarian Jews were being herded. Now, this was all in the small towns. However, in Budapest, things were a little different, because somehow the Jews were quickly gathered around and started to go, into hiding. Now, this is where the story of what happened to me in hiding. When this happened and the Jews were being deported, my mother realized very quickly she had to do something. So the first place that I was hiding that I remember, we were hiding in a hospital, and I remember being in a crib and people around me, and I knew I was in a hospital, and I guess we were posing as sick people. My mother had heard about a priest who was hiding some Jewish women, and she approached him and begged him to please do something for us. Apparently he was very nice, but he said, "I just can't do anything. I'm very, very sorry, but there's just nothing I can do. There's no place for you anymore." Well, most people would have, or a lot of people at least, would have said, "Well, they can't do anything. What are they going to do?" My mother insisted on trying and trying, and she kept after him until he finally relented, and he took us into his apartment. Now, he was living alone in that apartment, and he took us in. He took the four of us in. I was 4 years old at the time, and I was told only one person can step and walk in the apartment. Now, why is that? Well, because he was living alone. And if anybody would have known there was anybody else living with him, people would have reported him. So only one person was allowed to walk at a time. We were only allowed to whisper because, again, we were persona non grata, we weren't there. Somehow, when a 4-year-old is told to do something like walk one at a time, normally you would think they would be running, but no, a child of war is very, very different, and a child of war really listens to whatever they're told. During this time, of course, if you recall, Hungary was an enemy, and the Allies were bombing Budapest all the time. And we had what was called air raids. Now, what air raids were the warning of citizens to go into hiding with these sirens that went all over the city, and people went and hid in cellars. These apartment buildings in Budapest all had these big cellars, and people were very organized. And what they did is they made sure that when there was an air raid, everybody from the apartment buildings would scurry into the cellars, and they took roll call to make sure that everyone was safe. Well, where were we? We were in this priest's apartment, and we were, again, not there, right? So we hid in the little bathroom, which had no windows. And I remember often we were there a long time. And so my mother made a little bed, I remember, in the bathtub for my grandmother. In fact, this was a very scary time. And I remember the loud noises of the bombs, which were falling everywhere. In fact, one time, the windows actually scattered of the apartment that we were in. I think we were there about 6 weeks, not sure exactly. And after that, the priest found a place in a convent for my mother, my sister, and my grandmother. They were dressed as nuns and officially part of the convent. Now, what were they going to do with a 4-year-old? The 4-year-old had no place in that convent. And so the priest found a couple who was in his parish, and they took me in. They told me my name was whatever my name was, a different name. And they told me that I was to pretend that I was a cousin of theirs from the countryside. And I was not to talk to the people around me. Well, number one, you can imagine when a 4-year-old is told this is a secret. What usually happens when you tell a 4-year-old a secret? Every time when I present to students, they always laugh because many of them have little sisters and brothers. And of course, they know the first thing a 4-year-old does is blurt out, I have a secret, I have a secret. As I mentioned before, a child of war is very, very different than in normal circumstances. But these people put their trust and their faith into me. Because if I had said, blurted out that my mother is not here and whatever, they were risking their lives because they would have been killed. But I said, a child of war listens and obeys. And I never said a thing and pretended and did exactly what they told me to do. Because often we were in the cellars with other people, and other people always want to talk to little children. And I tried as much as possible not to talk to them. So during that time with the one couple that I was with, I found myself at the railway station with them. They decided to go to the countryside because there was no food in Budapest, or very little food in Budapest. And there was much more availability in the country. And they were going there. And that's where I was with them at the train station. And what I remember is I was absolutely terrified because as far as I knew, they were taking me with them and I would never see my mother again. Of course, what I didn't know is that arrangements had been made with the priest and my mother that they were going to come and get me. I will never forget the happiness that I felt when all of a sudden the priest and my mother came to get me and take me back. But taking me back did not mean taking me back and being with my mother. Taking me back meant that I was put with another couple and we went through the whole routine again. A different name, I was from the countryside, a different home to be in, and to be quiet and not talk to people. Well, this went on for another 4 months until until such time that the war was over. I'd like to tell you the tragedy of the Hungarian Jewish population. Because, as I said, the Hungarians were the last Jews to be deported. So in 1941, there were 825,000 Jews who lived in Hungary. 564,000 Hungarian Jews died of starvation, murder, and gassing, most of them in Auschwitz. So 1/3 of the Hungarian Jewish population survived, and only in the last 9 months of the war. So these 564,000 Jews, Hungarian Jews, died in the last 9 months. There was a very famous Swedish diplomat, Raoul Wallenberg, and he managed to save thousands of Jews, put them in safe houses, and also had false passports created for them. And they were saved. But all these Jews were saved were all from Budapest. So all the Hungarian Jews that perished, of course, there were Budapest Jews too, but most of the ones that perished were all from the countryside. Many of the Hungarian Jews, or the Budapest Jews, were hidden in churches and convents and private homes and hospitals. And I was one of the lucky 1/3 who survived being hidden with these two different families. In 1945, the war was over and the Russians occupied Hungary. I remember I was very excited because I was told I was going to be seeing my mother very soon. And what I remember being with the couple that I was with, there was a big march of the Russian soldiers walking the streets. Now I was very little, and of course I remember just seeing their feet, their legs, as they were marching. But somehow I was very excited, but somehow I knew that nobody else was. The people, the populace that were watching the marches were very quiet. There was no cheering. And I couldn't quite understand why I was so happy and they weren't, but I could feel, I had that feeling that they were not happy. Well, of course, why weren't they happy? Hungary had thought of the Russians as their enemy because they, of course, they had invaded them. And they also knew that they were communists and that their lives would be very, very curtailed from now on, which is, of course, what occurred. For me, I was reunited with my mother and my sister, my grandmother, and that was very exciting for me. Here's a picture of us after war is over, and we had a picture taken. At that time, of course, there was very little food available in Budapest. So my father had gotten in touch with my mother, where he had been hiding in the countryside, and they decided they were going to send my sister and me over to him for a while because there was food there, and that was not the case in Budapest. Budapest was war-torn, buildings had been crumbled. It was a very bad situation. And so she sent us on this trip in November. It was November. It was very cold. It was wintertime already. And I remember being on a cattle barge with hundreds of people, which unfortunately was overloaded. And we capsized into this big river. My sister, who was an excellent swimmer, had me in one hand. Remember, we were wearing winter clothing, but somehow she got us to the other side. And of course, I couldn't swim. And some farmers took us in and saved us. But many, many people did actually perish in that water. My mother heard about this accident, and you can imagine at that time, there was no communication, no telephones, very little communication, and that took time. So for a number of days, my mother didn't even know whether we had survived or not. She eventually heard that we had, by these farmers who had taken us in and took in all the people who had survived. And we eventually wound up and saw my father, and who was in camp, strangely enough, with Russian soldiers. And for me, I remember that time very happily, because the soldiers who had been separated from their parents, from their families, you can imagine their children, here was a little girl. So they taught me some Russian words, and I remember some Russian songs. I don't know how long we were there, but eventually my sister and I sent back to my mother in Budapest, and my father apparently somehow managed to escape and get into Austria. My parents were in touch with each other after that, and we were waiting, my mother was waiting for my father to try and get us legally into Austria. And after a certain amount of time, my mother realized this was not going to happen. And more, the Soviets, the Russians, the communists were closing in on Hungary, taking over the government, and not really allowing anybody to leave Hungary. My mother knew that it was time for her to take an important step, which was to try and escape Hungary and go into Austria without waiting for the official papers. And this is exactly what she did. She made arrangements, and we were trucked to the border. And at the border, there's a lake. It's called Lake Neusiedl. And here, that is exactly on the border. There we were met at night, and we went into this huge rowboat, and we proceeded to go across this lake. And every time there was any kind of a sound, we would go in and out of the bulrushes. And somehow we managed to escape. I do remember being very scared, because I knew that if we were caught, we would be shot. Somehow we weren't. We were met on the other side, and we were transported to Bad Gastein. Now, Bad Gastein was in Bad Gastein, there was a DP camp, a camp for displaced persons. There were about 2,000 people in Bad Gastein. Bad Gastein is a lovely town. It's Bad Gastein and Hofgastein. It's a resort town, actually. It's a thermal bath town, which is very popular with Germans and Austrians and Hungarians. They like to go to many thermal baths, and also a ski town. These 2,000 people were housed in these luxury hotels, resort hotels in Bad Gastein, which were of course empty because of the war. Bad Gastein is also well known for a waterfall. And what I remember is when we first got there, I couldn't sleep for a few nights because of the sound of the waterfall. So I know that the hotel, one of the hotels that I was in, certainly was near the waterfall. And this is just a little picture of this. This is a picture of me in a Hungarian costume doing the little dance called the Csárdas, which actually is the folk dance of Hungary. And at that time, there was, in Bad Gastein, there was a this DP camp was very well organized with a hospital, and people had committees and met. So apparently it was a very well organized camp. This is when I first went to school, first time in my life. I'd never been to school before. Of course, I had to learn German. So I learned German, and I was 7 years old before I went into school. And this is my report card. During that time in the DP camp, my sister had met an American GI and married him. And we all moved to Salzburg, my mother, my sister's husband, and I. And we lived there for about a year and a half or so. And I had a nephew who was born there in Salzburg. I remember being very excited because I became an aunt at the ripe age of 9. So that was very exciting for me. Here's a picture of Salzburg. It's a beautiful city. I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you have, you'll know that this place here, you go up, it's called High Salzburg, Hohen Salzburg, really lovely. Well, living there was fine until my brother-in-law was called back to America, to the United States, because remember, he was a GI. So they made plans, my sister and my nephew and my brother-in-law, they were being called back. And so my mother thought, well, okay, fine, no problem. We would be going to the United States. Well, that was not going to happen. That did not happen because my mother and I were not allowed to get into the United States. My sister was still an immigrant, even though she was married to the GI. So she had they couldn't vouch for us and get us in. Again, my mother used her resourcefulness and found a way that we could go to, quote, America, but basically it was America, North America, yes, but it was Canada. There were ways that we could get into Canada through the International Refugee Organization, which was very busy getting people to safe places. But at that time, my mother, or many of the Europeans, they really didn't think of the United States and Canada being separate. They only thought America, and America's streets were lined with gold. It's interesting. That was sort of the thought in Europe at that time. My sister had to leave, they left, and my mother was able to make arrangements that she would be able to go to Canada, to Toronto, Canada, because in Toronto, there were a big Jewish organization who opted to take in Jewish refugees from Europe. The only way my mother could go was to become a housekeeper for a Jewish family in Toronto. So these were all actually private ways that they vouched for refugees to come. There was no place for me as a child. And so what was my mother going to do? Now my father had all this time been living actually in Vienna, and really my parents weren't living together. And I only saw my father at different times, not that often, but enough that I knew he was my father and that I did love him, but not enough to really know him very well at all. The only way my mother was able to go was by herself. So she and my father made arrangements that I would go and live with him, and she would go to to Canada. And eventually she would send for me when she could. Again, I was not asked about this. I was told about this, and it was a little scary for me. In fact, it was probably very scary for me because I was going to live with my father, whom I didn't really know well, but that just was the situation. Here's a picture of my father. And in 1949, I moved to Vienna to live with my father. It turned out to be a very happy time for me. You can see here I'm dressed as a snowflake. And here's a picture of my classroom, one of my classrooms. And in those days, certainly at least in Vienna, there were classrooms, they weren't mixed. There weren't girls and boys in classrooms. So I was in a girls' school and there were boys' schools. And I was always with only girls. Interestingly enough, all these girls that I see here, I remember so very, very well. I was, of course, in touch with my mother all the time. My mother and I wrote to each other, and of course, and my father as well. And finally, my mother was able to send for me. She basically had fulfilled a year of being a housekeeper, and then she learned English. And then she had been a dressmaker. So she got a job as a dressmaker and was able to earn money and prove that she was able to support me. And so she and my father decided it was time for me to join her. And they made all kinds of arrangements. My father tried very hard to send me privately on an ocean liner and privately to go to Canada, but that was not accepted. The only way I could go was through the official channels as an immigrant, a refugee, through the International Refugee Organization. So this is a picture of my registration card. And my journey began in Vienna. And of course, my father and I had to say goodbye to each other. And by that time, I'd lived with him for almost 2 years. And I remember it was heartbreaking. I had to leave all my friends that I loved. I had to leave my books that I loved. I could take nothing with me. And I had to leave my father. And I remember we both cried because even though I was very sad and very upset, there was never a question of where I would go, even though my father actually at one time begged me to stay with him, which was heartbreaking. But I always knew, and that was the arrangement, that I would be with my mother. And so my journey began here in Vienna, and the destination was to go to Bremerhaven in Bremen, which is in Germany, and it's a port, and that is where I was going to meet my ship, where that was going to take me to Canada. This journey, which is 622 miles, that's all. It took 5 months because I left January 1, and all along the way, I stopped in different places in orphanages. So I was in an orphanage for a while, and then after a while, I was in another orphanage for a number of weeks or months, and so on and so forth. So 5 months. That was a pretty hard time because basically there was no one around that loved me or that I knew. I was just with strangers and being transported to orphanages. So eventually arrived in Bremerhaven and waited for the ship to arrive that was to take me to my mother. Here's the picture of the ship. And strangely enough, I found the name of the ship, which I found on my refugee papers, and I found the actual ship on the internet. And here's the actual ship. This ship during the war had been used for transport for soldiers. And then it was re-established for refugees. And this ship took many voyages, carrying refugees to Canada, to Australia, to all different places. It was, I think it was like it looks like a medium-sized ship. It wasn't a huge, huge ocean liner. And they were sort of two huge places where they put people for sleeping arrangements for the men and the women. Again, I was by myself. I was taken to this couple, and I was told that if I needed something, I should go and talk to them. Well, our journey began, and our destination was Halifax, Canada. It took 9 days in those days to cross. Today, an ocean liner crosses in 4 days or 5. Again, that was not a huge ship. And so weather was very, very bad. And I remember my voyage being sick the whole time, really, because there was such bad weather and the ship was not that big. So of course it was quite turbulent, you can imagine. We arrived in Halifax, and there I was put on a train. And luckily enough, there was another little girl from the ship, and we were both put on the train together. We were both going in the same direction. We had a little pocket in front of us with information about us, basically, our papers, and some money. And that was it. Now, we couldn't speak English, so we spoke German. I think I could say hello, thank you, and that was it. Luckily for us, the conductors were told about us, and they got us some pillows because we sat on that train for 3 nights and 2 days, sitting up the whole time. The conductors, every time they changed, were really wonderful to us. They got us food, and they were very nice. I remember them just smiling at us and making sure that we would eat and so on. But basically, we sat up for 3 nights and 2 days. And eventually I arrived in Toronto. The little girl I was with continued on to London, Ontario, which is about 100 miles away from Toronto. Often the questions that I get asked from my students is, did I keep in touch with her? And I'm sad to say I didn't. We didn't even think of it at that time. Communication wasn't thought of as important, or it's thought of differently than it is today. Today, you know, we would share our names and our information on our iPhones and keep getting in touch with people. I got off the train station and I was on the platform with my little suitcase, of course, looking to see where my mother was. Well, she wasn't anywhere. In Toronto at that time, they did not allow anybody on the platform except passengers. I must have been very scared. I can't speak the language. I couldn't speak the language. I'm standing there. I'm seeing a lot of adults walking, and here I am. Well, so I followed everybody. They were walking in a certain direction, which was the exit. And I just followed everybody. And I remember going up on a ramp, and lo and behold, I saw my mother. You can imagine how excited I was. Here's just again some pictures of me. Not pictures, my certificate of identity with my fingerprints. I arrived in Toronto, of course, saw my mother, and I lived there, went to school, learned English, got married. I gave birth to my mother. Gave birth to my mother, pardon me. I gave birth to my daughter and lived in Toronto till I was 28 years old. And then we moved to Montreal. I lived in Montreal for 10 years, and I gave birth to my son in Montreal. I also became a teacher in Toronto, and I taught in Toronto. Then we moved from Montreal to Seattle, and that was in 1978. And I've been living in Seattle ever since. And here is a picture of my family. And this is a picture of my nephew, the one that was born in Salzburg, the one that I was so proud to be an aunt at the age of 9. And here we are visiting him in Toronto. He lives in Toronto with his wife. This is me and one of my grandchildren. This is my son, and this is my daughter and my grandchildren and my son's wife. I want to finish with a quote from John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. If we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most important common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, and we all cherish our children's future. And we all are more mortal. Let's remember that. We are all the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aggie. We have a number of questions that I want to ask you that come from the people listening today. The first one I want to ask you comes from Carl, and he's interested to know if the families and the people who helped you were recognized as righteous among the nations.
I'm sorry, I'm fiddling with this. I'm having some trouble here.
No problem. Do you want just a minute to?
No, I think I'm fine now. Go ahead.
Sure. So the first question, the first question comes from Carl. And he's wondering if the people who helped you were recognized as righteous among the nations.
Unfortunately, no, because that should have been up to me. And, again, I don't even know who the people were and never was able to do that. And much to my chagrin, to my sorrow, really, that I couldn't do that. And the big thing that really bothers me the most is because the priests we did keep in touch with. In fact, many times my mother's brother, who survived the war also, my mother brought him over to Toronto often. And one summer, he came along with the priest who saved us and spent the summer with us. And I guess at that time, we weren't aware enough of putting him his name into the Yad Vashem. And I guess I don't know if it's too late, and I don't know anything about him. I just know his name. So that's the sad part.
I'm just curious, what was it like when he would come to visit?
Well, he was only one time. And I remember him, of course, to me, he was an old man, right? He's probably my age or older than I am now. It was a very nice visit. He was like part of the family. And he and my uncle had been, they were together, they were friends, really, they became friends in Budapest because my uncle stayed in Budapest. He never immigrated. And so he stayed in Budapest. And so they were like friends. So we're the two visitors from Budapest. And I remember my uncle very well. He was a very funny man and a lovely man, a warm man. And I remember the priest, Kalman, very well too. We had a very nice visit, and he was there, well, for the summer, so quite a few weeks.
Another question, and this ties into what you're saying, is did you learn to speak Hungarian when you were spending time in Hungary?
Well, I only spoke Hungarian, of course. It's not learning to speak Hungarian. I was Hungarian. I was a few months old when we moved to Hungary. My mother, my sister, and my grandmother only spoke Hungarian. Now, my father, who spoke Serbian, also spoke Hungarian. He spoke 6 languages. Don't forget, in Europe, a lot of people speak more than one language. My sister, I think, spoke 6 languages eventually too. We spoke Hungarian all the time. That was and also when you're in Europe, it's called a mother tongue. So Hungarian is my mother tongue, which means basically your first language.
Aggie, this next question comes from Steve, and he asks, how did your sister meet the American GI?
I have no idea. I mean, I was a child, probably in the DP camp, because don't forget the American soldiers were everywhere. And I remember actually they had always chocolate bars, Hershey's chocolate bars and gum. So those are my memories as a child. And they were, I'm sure, in the DP camp they visited and in Bad Gastein, so that's how she must have met him. Honestly, I don't know.
Another question comes from Sue, and she asks, after you arrived in Canada, did you ever see your father again?
That is a question that I'm often asked. I was in constant touch with him with letters and so on, but unfortunately he became ill in 1954. We had plans for me to go back eventually, but obviously not right away. And he died when I was 16 years old. So unfortunately, I never did get to see him. Of course, wrote letters back and forth all the time. And that was a very sad part of my recollection.
This next question comes from Hillary, and she writes, I'm so inspired by you, Aggie, and also your mother. Can you tell us how she adapted to living in Canada?
Well, my mother was quite an enigma. She adapted beautifully. My mother went right away. The people that she first worked for as a housekeeper adored her. And, they knew that she was not like she had been, in Europe, she had housekeepers. So it was very funny because I remember this little story. They had 2 teenage daughters. And when my mother moved in as their housekeeper, the lady of the house made the young girls make their own beds so that my mother wouldn't have to make the beds for them. I mean, she was really treated like part of the family. But she learned English, went out and got a job to get me, to make money to get me. My mother was always the life of the party, had a lot of friends. She was the kind of person that loved people. And when you love people, people love you. And so she adapted beautifully and made sure that I adapted that way too.
Aggie, here's another question. This one comes from Rick, and he writes, do you know if you still have family in Hungary?
No, my uncle was the only actual family, and I had one cousin. My mother had an older brother who died during the war. He died of typhus. And so he had a daughter. And so she was a cousin who was the same age as my sister, older than me, and my uncle who was in Hungary. And they have both since passed away. And that's the only family that I had. We did not have many other family. Now, again, like I said, my father's family, I don't know anything about them except that they all perished in Yugoslavia, in Belgrade. But I have no idea if they had cousins and so on. But from all I know is that they did perish.
So Aggie, with this personal history and growing up and being moved around and separated from your parents and in hiding, I'm wondering, how do you think that has affected you as an adult? And what was it like when you started sharing your personal stories for the first time?
Um, I, when I was first asked to share the story, truthfully, I was not ready to do that. And so I've only been sharing my story about, I think, 4 or 5 years instead of 10 years ago when I was first asked, because it was too difficult for me emotionally. And then I finally decided to, and I'm absolutely happy to do that. Again, I enjoy very much sharing my story, especially with the younger generation in the schools, because again, I was a teacher, and that brings me back to my days of teaching, which I enjoy, and I enjoy the young people very much. It is, sometimes it's a little difficult because when I tell a story, I look at this little girl, and that little girl's me. And when I look at all the things she's gone through, and again, these are not things I think about every day, of course not. But when I give my story, I look at this little girl, and I really feel sorry for her. And I think, oh my God, all the things she's gone through emotionally and being separated from loved ones, it's her mother and so on, and the fears. These are interesting things that it does take a little bit of an emotional toll, a little bit on me, but I think it's really important for people who don't know about the Holocaust to know from people who've actually been there. So I think it's an important thing.
So Aggie, so much of our youth today are struggling with just the uncertainties of our world, and so many changes, and just some of the difficult times we're in. As a Holocaust survivor, what advice would you have for our youth today?
Basically, that's why I read what I read at the end of my presentation from John Kennedy, because I think what we have to remember, and I think to me that's one of the whole purposes of my presentation, or of all of our presentations. Underneath, we're all the same, and as much of a struggle it is, as more for some people than others, we are all the same, and we cannot judge and should not judge people by their religion, by the color of their skin. That's so very, very important. And if nothing else, for us as well, the Holocaust, the change begins with me. Let's make sure, and I try to tell the students that, and people, that we must not have any prejudices of any kind, and so that something like the Holocaust can never happen again. And we are struggling in our country right now with a lot of those problems. And to try not to think that way is the most important thing, I think.
Aggie, thank you so very much for sharing your story with us today, and for these incredible words of wisdom. I want to read you just one comment, maybe to close us out here, that came in from Mary, and she writes, "I'm so grateful that you are willing to share your story. It must not be that easy, but what a powerful story of strength. You inspire us to all live a better life. Thank you so very much. I'm so impressed by your family's story and will never forget it."
Thank
So
you.
there were so many comments and questions, and thank you to everybody for writing in all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them. Aggie will pass them all on to you so that you can read them after this program.
Thank you. That would be great, because that really touches me. And thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for your comments. I really, really appreciate it. And I appreciate having had the privilege of doing this presentation. And I hope you learned something from it. I'm sure we all do every time. Thank you, Alana, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Aggie. This program was recorded, and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with other past Lunch and Learn presentations. Please feel free to share it with others who might have missed it, or you can come back and rewatch it. If you're looking for more, please consider joining us tomorrow afternoon for a conversation with local author Brian Crawford on his young adult novel, The Weaver's Scar, which is about a Rwandan boy who manages to escape the 1994 genocide in Rwanda and makes it to America. That is at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and you can find all the information on our website. I want to thank our incredible staff at the Holocaust Center. These programs are truly a team effort. And I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, who's working on the technical side of these shows behind the scenes. He's our museum and technology director. Also, a huge thank you to our executive director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Dradel, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, and Craig Vernice, who helped to prepare Aggie's presentation. Next week, please join us for the SS Officer's Armchair, Uncovering the Hidden Life of a Nazi, with author Daniel Lee in conversation with journalist Knut Berger. During a dinner party in Florence a few years ago, Daniel Lee was told a very strange story, and the guest recounted how her mother had recently taken an armchair to an upholsterer in Amsterdam. While repairing the chair, they found a bundle of swastika-covered documents inside the chair's cushion. The SS Officer's Armchair is a detective story and a reconsideration of daily life in the Third Reich. You can find more details on our website along with a link to the book, and you can register for next week's program. Thank you again for attending today, and we hope to see you back here next week, Tuesday, for our last Lunch and Learn of 2020. And there's more to come in 2021. Thank you so much, everybody. This concludes our program.